Hi, Jeff Spira here again. And in this video, I want to talk to you about materials you use to build boats. I'm particularly talking about the wood you use in my boats, not necessarily the fasteners or the glues. Those will be in additional videos that I'm planning to create. So anyway, so my boats aren't really wooden boats. I've said this in some other videos, and I've printed it in some of my information and manuals and things. So they're, traditional wooden boats are traditional sawn or bent frame hulls with, carvel or clinker planking, added to the top of them. So mine are really unibody structures. I designed them to be one-piece composite hulls built of wood, of course, and then covered on the outside with fiberglass. So it's not a collection of individual parts all sailing together, held together with fasteners. So the wood actually becomes part of this unibody structure that I recommend you build. So, traditional materials that other designers might call out may or may not be appropriate for my boats. I get a lot of comments on Facebook pages and in forums and things like that about what people think they ought to build boats out of, and that may or may not be appropriate for my boat. Maybe it was the appropriate for someone else's design. And that's fine too. So it's people can design them any way they want. So it's okay with me. So, I'll see a lot of things like people will ask, oh, you need marine plywood? And then a bunch of people will jump in and say, absolutely, you got to build it out of marine plywood. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. It's silly if you don't. And other people will jump in and say, no, I don't think you need it and all that. Well, I'll get into that in a minute, things like that. So again, mine are lumber framed, glued structures with glued on plywood planking. So, and then the outside's covered with fiberglass. I also designed some stitch and glue boats, and in the smaller sizes, these are really plywood structures that are just edge bonded together. But in larger sizes, stitch and glue is really, all the plywood is there is to form a mold. So you leave it in place when you glass it inside and out. But the only reason it's there is to hold the shape of the fiberglass in place. So until it cures. So on my 20-foot V-bottom stitch and glue boats, for instance, you could build it just as easily out of foam or honeycomb like Plascore, Nidacore, one of those kinds of things. As you could out of plywood. So. When I first got started building boats was back in the early days of Radcraft, and they were all, stapled together, 1/2-inch, plywood right from the it was ABX or ACX ply really, from the hardware store, and then we glassed them inside and out, and you just leave the plywood inside because it's already there and it's holding everything together while it cures. So. Anyway, for my boats, I suggest that you use construction-grade lumber, okay? And construction-grade lumber are typically softwoods, which are conifers trees, and they're evergreen trees. So anything that's green year-round will be appropriate. And we use them in the U.S. and Canada to build houses. All the houses here are lumber. I listened to an interesting video by a guy that moved here from England, and he said all of our houses are made of brick. He just said, it's just he was really surprised about the lumber houses that we have here, and he said they're just as comfortable and just as insulated, and he was very, very happy about them. But I know some people are thinking, we have well, we have huge forests of conifer trees here in the U.S. and Canada. So people talk about, well, save a tree, don't use a plastic bag. That was an old joke years ago. But in the U.S. and Canada, we grow about 2 times as many board feet of lumber every year as we use. So the forests are getting much bigger. In fact, there are more trees in the U.S. today than there were when Columbus landed. And they're increasing in size. We plant all the trees that we use, for instance, for paper. Those are all grown, just like corn is grown to make Fritos. We grow trees to make paper, and so it's not a there's plenty of wood here, and there's be plenty more. So your Home Depot isn't going to run out of lumber for some dumb reason because they're grown and harvested for lumber and cut up and used. So the types of trees we typically use are as softwoods, which are the conifer trees, the evergreens. I'll come in these groups like Douglas fir, eastern white pine, hem fir, ponderosa pine, redwood, spruce, southern pine, and western red cedar. These are typically the woods that are used for construction, and this is typically what you'll find in the construction lumber racks and in Lowe's or Home Depot or your friendly local lumber yard. So they're easy to work with. They cut really well and plane well. It's readily available, inexpensive. So any of my boats can be built with any of these species of lumber. Are some better than others? Yeah, maybe. I live out here in the West where typically there isn't a lot of humidity. So, we have problems with, it's really a desert in Southern California. So it tends to dry things out. So it's pretty good on the longevity for boats. But so you have to maybe think about what kind of lumber in your area that you're going to use that's going to resist water damage. So, but I think they'll all work to build my boats. And again, picking one is as easy as going down and seeing what the best grade lumber you can get and pricing and all that stuff. They're all strong enough to build my boats with, for instance. And one of the things that these pieces of wood have are knots. So a knot is really a dead branch that has died years ago, and the tree kind of grew around it. So it's kind of the remains of a dead branch that's there. So, and they can be either loose or tight. A loose one has got a space between the knot and the lumber around it, and a tight one is more closely attached. So if you have tight knots in wood, all of them, and they're away from the edges or corners, well, that's good. That's a good piece of lumber, and you can use it for building one of my boats. But if you have a loose knot and it's near a corner, particularly an edge or a corner of the lumber, that turns into a stress riser, is what engineers call it, which means it's a place, well, let me describe it by, have you ever cut a piece of glass? Well, you take a little wheel and you scratch the glass, and the little wheel just cuts a little fine scratch in the glass, and then when you push on it, it snaps. So that's really the definition of a stress riser. So if you can get so that's really what'll happen in a piece of lumber that's got a knot in the corner. That'll cause an area of high stress. So if you whack it, that's where it's going to crack and break. So I would avoid those. Now my boats can be built with loose knots in the corners if they're small. And people ask me, can I make the lumber thinner? Yeah, well, yeah, you can, but make sure you've got better grade lumber. I just don't want to see any loose knots in the corners. So that's kind of how I size my lumber, and I also size it based on what you can buy off the shelf. So my both metric and inch boats are fashioned around lumber that you can just go in the store and buy that finished size. So now some people ask, can you use hardwoods for this? Well, sure. You know, hardwoods are broadleaf trees or deciduous trees. And that's the kind of trees that lose their leaves every fall. The leaves fall off and then regrow in the spring. So that's what we typically call hardwood trees. So, you know, a lot of people say, yeah, it's got to be oak. I want to make an oak boat. Okay. Well, just remember, it's a lot more expensive and it's a lot heavier. It takes a lot more work to plane or to you know, do anything with handwood, to drill or anything. It's not going to be an easy build. It's fine if you have the appropriate tools and the know-how to work with lumber, and you have the time and effort. But if you're trying to get something together quickly, it's not you know, it's not really necessary. And my boats are kind of designed around being built out of softwoods, so they're plenty strong enough if built out of softwoods. But if you want to use hardwoods, sure, why not? Go ahead. It's good. It's not really needed, but if you want to show off your skills, hey, go for it, you know. But be sure and give it a try. I mean, do some planing on the wood before you try and build a whole boat with it, because you might be biting off more than you can chew, or at least more than time than you want to spend on it by doing that. So there's plenty of other hardwoods besides oak. You know, there's poplar, which you can buy at Home Depot pretty inexpensively. There's walnut, maple, birch, cherry, and, you know, all kinds of different woods that you can buy. Again, they're more expensive. They're harder to work, and you know, it's just more time consuming to build a boat that way. The top of the heap for boats is teak. Well, it has its own issues with cutting it and bending it and gluing it. You know, it's got a heavy oil content, for instance. So it may not be, you know, really appropriate to build a simple boat like I do. Now, if you want to put, you know, teak decking on your you know, 45-foot sailboat, hey, go for it. Or build a teak swim step on the back of your you know, T-top, something like that. Hey, great, go for it. But it has its own issues, and it's a lot of work to build a boat out of it. Just wanted to let you know that. So again, these are all harder and heavier and more expensive than the softwoods that I typically recommend. So. Okay, well, after you get the framing of the boat all built, then you need to cover it. And my boats are all designed to be covered with plywood. So they're designed in such a way that the plywood only needs to bend along one axis. So you don't need to torture the plywood. So now a lot of people talk about marine grade plywood. Well, let's see. People talk about that it takes care of voids and it doesn't check, and there's all kinds of things you hear about it. But, you know, back in the good old days, I don't know, when I was a kid, they used to talk a lot about, you know, in cartoons, for instance, they talk about when a horse gets old, they'd haul him away to the glue factory. You ever hear of that? I assume they used horses' hooves and such, where they'd boil them down and make glue out of them. But those were natural glues that they used to glue wood with, but they were soluble in water. So you know, that was always the thing, was natural, some sort of natural glue that would fall apart, you know, when you used it. So, but many years ago they switched to all synthetic glues for making lumber. You know, here in the U.S. and Canada, I don't know whether they still use natural glues some places in the world. It's possible, but I would tend to doubt it because the synthetic glues are so, available and inexpensive. So, in fact, I see they're going away from some of the, resorcinol glues and things like that that used formaldehyde in them, and they're going to soy-based glues now, which hold up just fine in water typically. Anyway, so all plywood these days is made of a synthetic glue. Now, that used to be what determined the difference between external plywood and internal plywood, was the type of glue used. So, but pretty much all plies have the same glue as marine ply. So again, marine ply used to be that it had no internal voids and it used an external synthetic glue. Now everything is glued that way. So so that's that's something to pay attention to. So, but in marine ply, the holes in the internal plies are filled. Now, I'm sure you've looked at a piece of ply and you've seen those football-shaped holes that they fill knot holes with. Now, typically they don't fill knot holes in the inside plies, but they do in marine ply. They'll fill those knot holes. Now, so marine plies tend to be very pricey because there's a lot of work goes into them. And that's why they're, $100 a sheet for a piece of 1/4-inch ply, something like that. So it typically I don't necessarily say that you need marine ply in my boats. I recommend it if you plan on building the boat and not glass covering it, and you want to leave it in the water for long periods of time, like in a slip. Then I would say, yeah, go for marine ply. But most use when you trailer the boat and stuff like that, some good old ABX ply will be just fine. Now the A is one side, and that means it does not have any knots, and the B is the other side, and that means the knots are filled with those football-shaped plugs, so that there's no exposed areas that go through the area. And then X means exterior glue. So if you buy ABX ply, that's typically sufficient for my boats. And again, that means you would glass the outside when you're done. So that would be the right way to do it. So there's another kind of plywood that has no voids and exterior glue, and that's hardwood plies. They're really typically intended for underlayment. I think these are a fine choice for boats. Home Depot carries a wood called sandy wood, which I think is a South American hardwood. It's pretty inexpensive. And much of the rest of the world, you can get this birch ply from Russia, I think. That's pretty inexpensive as well. But there's a wide variety of different plywoods that are typically made of hardwoods and are useful for building boats. So I tend to use those. I use the Home Depot sandywood ply, the underlayment that you can buy. It's not much more than ABX, and it has no voids, and it glasses well and glues well, and I would use it. If you're buying that birch ply, though, you might want to boil some of it. And there used to be a bunch of mahogany ply that came out of, I think it was the Philippines, that you would want to boil as well. Now some of it is fine and it doesn't it doesn't delaminate, but some of it you boil it and it delaminates. Again, I don't know. I haven't messed with any of that in the last 15 or 20 years. It may be much better now. I just don't know. But get a small piece of it and put it in some boiling water and let it sit for a couple hours, and and then turn the water off, and then just see if you can peel it apart, and that will kind of give you a hint about whether or not they used some good glue and good gluing methods on it, so that it'll hold up for a boat. So again, I don't know that that's really the case anymore, but give it a shot anyway. So now, on some of my boats, I recommend using 2 layers of plywood. I've seen posts and forums and stuff like that. And that Spyro guy can't be a real engineer, If why would he ever put fiberglass in between the 2 layers of ply? That's stupid. It needs to be on the outside or the inside. He doesn't know what he's doing. So, okay, well, maybe for maximum bending strength, you're right. It needs to be on the outside and the inside. But I worry about that joint in between. If you squeeze the joint too closely together, like when you bend it around a boat, you can starve the joint of epoxy. So back in my years ago, I used to work for a company that made the bearing material that goes underneath CNC ways, and it's a 40% 40% brass filled or bronze filled Teflon material with some anti-wear agents and other things in it. And we used to glue that to steel underneath the CNC mills. And we had to build our own glue. We had to dissolve 5 thousandths of an inch microbeads in the epoxy resin, so that when you spread it out, it would have those beads in place, and it would keep a separation between the two pieces of material that you were gluing. So the joint could not starve. So the reason I suggest putting ply between the glass between the 2 layers of ply is it provides that spacing in there to make sure that the epoxy cures and holds the 2 pieces of lumber together. Because some of those bends are pretty tough to make with a 1/2-inch piece of ply. Did you ever try and bend a 1-inch piece of ply? You're not going to get there from here. Now, yeah, you could mix micro balloons in the glue and not use any glass in there, and that might be appropriate. But glass is pretty cheap. I mean, I think it's $8 for a 50-inch wide yard of it, so it's a pretty good thing to stick in there. It's just a piece of cloth that you put between the two, and when you put epoxy on it, it's pretty thin. The 6-ounce glass that I recommend is pretty thin, so it will make sure that the spacing is there. So anyway, and have you ever? Here's another thing that you should think about, though, when you're talking about gluing 2 pieces together. Have you ever heard of Chabham armor? Well, that's what they use on the M1A1 Abrams, and the reason it's so invincible, and the reason other people's cannons shells bounce off of them, is because it's made of a bunch of layers, and some of them are very hard layers, and some of them are softer layers, and some of them are bendable soft layers, and that makes it very, very puncture resistant when it comes to shooting a high powered cannon shell at it, so a very high velocity cannon shell. So that's, it's a big secret how Chabham armor works and how it's built, but the key to it is it's a whole bunch of layers. So anyway, my hulls, by using glass in the middle, kind of give you that soft but bendable part in the middle and a little stiffer on the fiberglass. And so they would become much more puncture resistant by using glass in the middle than just by glue. So anyway, that's another issue that you should think about. Okay, well, that's it with lumber and ply covering. If you have any questions about that or anything I didn't really explain here, please leave a comment and ask me about it. Thank you very much for watching this. I'm going to post this on both Facebook and my website and on YouTube. I'd love it if you go to YouTube and subscribe to my channel and hit the bell so that you get notified of future postings. And if you are interested in any of my boat designs, I think there's 107, but there may be a few more boat designs on my website. Be sure to go to spirainternational.com and go to the page that says boat designs and have a look. There's in different kinds of categories, and take a look at it. And each one has pictures if I have them, and some videos on some of them. And if you like, you can download free study prints for any of the designs. And if you'd like to join the insider section while you're there, please do. And that allows you to download some free ebooks and some seminars I've delivered and a bunch of reports and a bunch of other interesting information. So go on and join that as well while you're there. Thanks again.